is the good news in that passage. That is literally what gospel means, good news. So when I read a passage out of any of the gospels, my first question that I ask myself is, where is the good news in this passage? This is an interesting one because it's almost like a bad news, good news passage. This is a story of disruption. It's a major disruption. Jesus walks into the temple, and in a minute I'll just explain a little bit of what all the temple meant to the people of Jesus' day. But he walks into the temple and he turns over tables and he scatters coins and he orders people out. And everybody wonders, who is this guy? And how dare he come in and disrupt what we have been doing, our time-honored traditions, how we do business. I was trying to think of, what could we compare this to today? What could we compare it to? And the only thing I came up with, and I hesitate to say it, but our church bazaars. I love church bazaars, so I'm not trying to say that our church bazaars are wrong, but can you imagine if somebody came in off the street as you're holding your church bazaar and overturned the tables of goods that you're selling and ordered the people who were making soup for your soup dinner to get out because this is not the place to do. We would say, who in the world are you? And what business do you have coming into our church and telling us what to do? It was a huge disruption. And I think sometimes we have to acknowledge the disruption before we get to the good news. We are a people who know a little bit about disruption, aren't we? We are living through one of the greatest disruptions in my life, and not just one. We're living through several disruptions at the same time. We have the pandemic, which has disrupted not only life, but church life in ways that I don't remember in all of my 60 years ever having lived through. It has disrupted people's finances. It has disrupted families. I have 5 grown children, and it is over a year now since we have all been together as a family. When Valentine's Day came, it felt sad to me because I said to Lee, we have now gone through every single holiday in a year without being able to gather together. It's a disruption. It has disrupted families who have lost people. It has disrupted our healthcare system. It has disrupted, I've never seen so many empty shelves in Walmart before. I mean, all of our systems have been disrupted by this pandemic. But it's not only the pandemic, we've had the disruption of racial unrest tear through our country, and in our state, we're getting ready for it to happen again as the trial for Derek Chauvin begins. I think it's this week. So our brothers and sisters who are worshiping today in the Twin Cities, I can tell you, are very aware of that disruption as well. We are living through the disruption of division in our country, political division and cultural division in our country. We are living through a time of unprecedented disruption. So we know what that's like, and it's uncomfortable, isn't it? It's hard. It can be despairing to live through disruption. We also are living through disruption in our United Methodist Church, and we have been for a lot of years. And we all expected that in 2020, that disruption would there would begin to be some closure because General Conference would meet and we would make some decisions. And from those decisions made there, we could make decisions as well. And we could move on from what has been dividing us into ministry and mission focused on what we believe Jesus is calling us to do. But that was disrupted. And we had to postpone it for a year. And now you've probably heard we had to postpone it again for another year. So we continue to kind of live in that uneasy time of not knowing what is coming next. I have said many times as I have visited churches this year, it's a shame to waste a good crisis. In other words, it's a shame to not see the good news that can also come out of disruption. And I want to focus on the good news that is in this passage, but first I want to just talk a little bit about the good news that I have seen in the church. 2 years ago, before the pandemic, we were a church, a denomination that was focused almost solely on what was dividing us. and then a pandemic hit. And you know what? All of that talk about whether we were going to divide, how we were going to divide, when we were going to divide, that disappeared. And it's not that it wasn't still there, but we were focused on something greater. We were focused on how do we help our neighbors, our communities, our families, our nation survive a pandemic. It was a higher calling, I think. And we started realizing, I think, in some places that we have more in common than we have that divides us. We have more that unites us than divides us. Because we all care about our churches. We all care about our families. We all care about our communities. We all care about our neighborhoods. We all care about our nation. We might not all agree on the ways to do that, but we do care. And that's a good thing. That's good news to realize that. In Jesus' gospel here, this is so interesting, the words that Jesus chooses, because it's almost like he keeps putting it in their face. If you understand the Jewish people at the time of Jesus, the temple was the place where God resided. And remember, Solomon built the big, beautiful temple. And in the celebration, they witnessed God moving into the temple to live among God's people. And then they went through a time of exile, and the temple was destroyed. And the people had to leave their homeland. And they wandered, they were taken into exile. It was a very difficult time for the people. And then we read in Nehemiah and Ezra how when the people were allowed to go back to their homeland, and they were allowed to rebuild their temple, it was a time that filled them with such hope. The temple wasn't nearly as grand as the one that Solomon had built, but it was still the temple and all that the temple signified. God was with them again in their land. God was present with his people. So Jesus then, when they say, who in the world are you to come in here and disrupt the way we operate in this place, what does Jesus say? Tear down this temple, and I'll build it again in 3 days. Tear down this temple. Those had to sound like words of blasphemy for the people who were there. Tear down the temple, tear down the place where God resides with us. Tear this down. I mean, that was unthinkable for these people. But Jesus goes on to say, I can rebuild it in 3 days. Well, of course they laugh at that. What did they say? It took 46 years to build this temple, and you one person are going to rebuild this in 3 days? But they didn't know that Jesus was where God was residing. Jesus came in the flesh to give us the fullest revelation of God. And even though we would reject that and we would tear that down, God would raise that again in 3 days. There is nothing we can do to destroy God's presence with us. That's the good news in this passage. There is nothing that we can do to take away God's presence from us. The worst has already been done, right? Good Friday already happened. The worst was done. And how did God respond? God gave us Easter Sunday. He raised Jesus from the dead. And God remains with us. It reminds me of the verse in Romans chapter 8. We know that in all things, God works for good with those who love him, those whom he has called according to his purpose. All things. It doesn't mean that God causes all things to happen. God didn't send a pandemic so that we would begin to maybe appreciate our communities and our churches and our neighborhoods and our families more. God didn't do that, but God will work through a pandemic to help us appreciate our communities, our families, our neighbors, our churches more. I think that even in this time of political division and racial unrest, as hard as all of this is, I think God is going to work good through that too. And I think that we have the opportunity today to be relevant to people who have said the church has nothing for me. I think we have the opportunity today to be relevant to those people in ways that we haven't for a long time. Because we are a nation right now that is filled with anger, and with fear. And those are really hard to live with for long periods of time. And as followers of Jesus Christ, we have the opportunity to say, we know a better way to be together. We know a better way to build community. We know how to live with hope and with joy and with love, even towards those who may not like us, may not agree with us. We have been given the blueprint for how to do that, and the blueprint is called grace. But we have this to offer to our communities, to our family members maybe, who are so angry or so fearful of what's going to happen. We have this to offer to our neighborhoods. We have this to offer into the political process. We know how to build community that is filled with hope and has joy and loves one another, even when it's hard. We know this, and I believe that makes us very relevant to the world in which we live today. So there is good news. The good news is God is with us in Jesus Christ. And whether we are surviving a pandemic, whether we are mourning a disruption in our life, and I listened to the prayers that Pastor Ken was praying this morning, and I heard so many disruptions, cancer and surgery and death. We all have disruptions personally, as well as those that are affecting us as a people. In the midst of disruptions, in the midst of division, Jesus lives with us, God with us every day. And that is some very, very good news. So thank you for just spending a few minutes taking a look at this passage of scripture with me. And I encourage you to think about that. How are the ways in which you can go out from here today and every day, and when you are speaking with your neighbors, when you are talking with your family members, when we can gather together again, how can we model, how can we speak the love and the hope and the joy that we have found, that we know through Jesus Christ? Amen.